Hello and welcome back to another episode of the BitTech Modding Toolbox. Today we're going to be taking a look at hand files, sandpapers, and a few devices that help you use them. We're going to kick things off by having a look at a completely underrated tool in my opinion, hand files, and by extension, needle files and diamond needle files. Now, these are really useful for smoothing out all sorts of edges, as well as taking off material in mods. I use them all the time for mine and they're absolutely essential for me. The first thing you'll probably notice with different files is that they come in a load of different shapes and sizes. So we're going to be taking a look at the larger ones. So these are engineer's files. These are going to be used for major roughing work. You're not going to get a really fine finish, but you are going to be able to remove a lot of material and get your edges nice and straight and clean again. Engineer's files come in three grades. The bastard cut for removing lots of material, the second cut for smoothing out that said edge, and then the final cut, which is going to be much smoother and more controlled. I have second cut files, and these do most of the job that I need. I don't really need a bastard cut for working with metal or for plastics. They're particularly useful for wood though. One of the handy things about files is that they're just not very expensive. I've got some cheap ones from B&Q, which has some nice rubber handles, easy to use. They're not that great, but they've done enough for me. Really, you should be looking at getting some proper Swiss-made files from a brand such as Grobe, Valob, or Ferd. It's worth noting that Swiss-made files tend to come with just the blade itself, so you're going to have to buy a handle separately and attach it. In addition to some engineer's files, I use these a lot, needle files. They're really useful for high detail work and also for finishing edges on panels, or if you're trying to make sure something is particularly accurate to maybe a diagram or to another scale that you're working to. As with engineer's files, you should be looking to have Swiss-made files for these. They were designed primarily for clockmaking and jewellery work, so they're very fine. And also make sure that you've got safe edges. So you've got to look for safe edges in any of the descriptions, or you can make your own by grinding down one of the surfaces. Safe edges are really quite important because they allow you to be much more accurate with your work. You can go straight up to the side of a project without worrying about cutting into it by accident. So definitely make sure you keep an eye out for those. There's a huge variety of different shapes and sizes for needle files, so you really might want to think about what you're going to be using them for before you make any purchases. Conveniently enough, they do come in sets quite often, such as this one that I've got, which covers all the basics, and then you can maybe expand into things that you didn't have beforehand or that you really need. Within needle files, you're going to have two main types. You've got the standard metal-based ones. These have a grain structure to them and can only be used in one specific direction. That's important to note. Or you can have diamond-coated ones. Diamond-coated files come in a range of grits, much like sandpaper does. So you can use them to get very fine results. They also don't depend on one particular direction being used. So you can use them in a saw fashion or a draw fashion. It doesn't really matter. Just make sure that you get some high-quality ones where the coating isn't going to fall off and they'll be nice and durable. Sandpapers and abrasive pads are simply an essential tool. You need them for any kind of metal work, or if you're going to be polishing, smoothing edges, or if you're going to be doing paint work. So it's really important to have a good selection available in your workshop. The main considerations with sandpapers are looking at the grit type and also the construction of the paper itself. So typically you're going to have glass papers, aluminium oxide papers and emery cloths, or silicon carbide wet and dry. Sitting at the lower end of the grit scale, we have glass papers. Now these use sand for the abrasive side and are best suited for soft materials like wood and plastic. I wouldn't advise it for metal because the actual sand itself is not hard enough for it. Typically you'll find these in some of the coarser grits, maybe starting at 60 grit, working up to 80 and topping up at about 240 for a fine grit, because that's a fine grit in woodworking. Moving up the hardness scale, we have aluminium oxide papers and cloths. So these are well suited for working with metals and other hard materials because aluminium oxide is a very tough material itself, it's sapphire. Aluminium oxide papers come in a huge range of grits, ranging from really quite coarse, maybe 120, right the way up to 1,000 or maybe even more. They also come in different backing papers, so you can either have a plain paper, or you can use maybe an emery cloth, which is much more useful for hard-working metal tasks. Finally, we have a silicon dioxide wet and dry paper. Now this is going to be used for your final polishing and for working with very hard materials because silicon dioxide is really tough. The issue is it's very brittle, so you don't want to be using 80 grit, 100 grit. So we're going to be starting maybe at 240 grit, working our way all the way up to 3000 if you're going to be doing polishing or paint work. The key feature of wet and dry papers is that they use a waterproof backing and a waterproof adhesive. Now this allows you to use water or an oil-based lubricant to be able to smooth your finish. By applying water to the paper, it helps to get a much smoother and glossier finish on any of the sanded surfaces. One thing that's worth considering is the strength of the adhesive involved in the actual paper itself. So hand-based papers tend to have a weaker adhesive than machine-based ones. So this means you can actually use a machine paper like these sanding discs for standard handwork, but you can't use standard hand paper for a machine. So just bear that in mind. There are also a number of handy little devices that allow you to use sandpapers more easily on flat surfaces or harder areas, such as this hand sander, which just has normal paper that clips into the side, or a cork block or even emery blocks that have the sanding built into the actual block itself. These hand sanders are particularly useful, I found, for making brushed materials because it's much easier to get a consistent grain going in only one direction using the handle. We're going to be covering machine-operated abrasives in a future video, but for now this covers the basics of the hand-operated ones. Be sure to check out the full article because it's a deep topic and we've barely scratched the surface.